I was ankle-deep in cow manure when a man in a tie walked up and handed me a bill for $47,322.14. According to him, the Homeowners Association claimed my late uncle's ranch had unpaid fines stretching back to 1997, 2 years before I was even born. Then, with all the tact of a debt collector reading off a script, he casually threatened foreclosure. What he didn't know and what would become his biggest mistake was that I wasn't just a city-bred nephew wearing muddy boots. I'm a licensed land use attorney. And somewhere between his smug smirk and my manure-soaked jeans, I realized they'd made one hell of a legal error. At first, I thought the whole thing was a joke. Maybe a neighbor with a twisted sense of humor or some fake debt scam. But the guy shiny shoes, clipboard, and a power trip tie was dead serious. He cleared his throat like he'd practiced it in a mirror and said, as per HOA guidelines, the cumulative penalties on this property amount to $47,322.14. You have 30 days to pay or the association will begin foreclosure proceedings. I blinked, looked down at the muck on my boots, then looked back up at him. You walk through that gate, past 2 goats and a rusted-out tractor, to tell me my barn is too ugly? He didn't even flinch. So there I stood, on a run-down plot of stubborn land I wasn't even sure I wanted, holding a bill that accused my dead uncle of aesthetic crimes going back to the Clinton administration. The timeline didn't even make sense. Uncle Lou had owned this ranch since the early 80s, decades before any HOA even existed. Long before some developer with dreams of curated communities decided to slap vinyl fences and HOA rules on a patch of dusty scrubland. And besides 1997? I wasn't even potty trained yet. According to Clipboard Man, the violations included unauthorized fencing, non-compliant livestock containment, and me personal favorite, unapproved shade structures, which I assume referred to the tractor roof Lou propped up for the goats. Yeah, real eyesore. They should have handed him the death penalty. I asked the man his name. Of course, it was Brad. Brad handed me a pamphlet, smiled like a waiter serving a check after a terrible meal, and said, "The HOA is willing to negotiate if you're cooperative." Then he offered me the chance to join the community formally, whatever that meant, and walked off like he'd just delivered some divine mandate. I stood there for a long moment, the absurdity soaking in along with the stink. And then I laughed. Not because it was funny. It was just so ridiculous, so beyond belief, that it short-circuited my brain. Let me set the record straight. I didn't inherit some estate in the hills. My Uncle Lou's ranch was 50 acres of defiant dirt, falling down structures, and a whole lot of middle-finger energy aimed at bureaucracy. He built it himself. Ran it like a one-man frontier. I hadn't seen him in years when I got the call that he said no will, no kids, just me. The city nephew. Left with everything from the house to the hens. I'd come out thinking I'd clean up a few things, sign a few papers, maybe sell it to the state. Instead, I found peace. Dusty, weird peace. And it definitely didn't look like anything in a polished HOA brochure. But the more I thought about it, the more it reeked worse than the manure. First of all, how does an HOA find a property before it exists? That night, I sat in the only room with working electricity, flipping through what papers Lou hadn't torched or fed to the goats. Nothing. No notices. No liens. No warning letters. Just this sudden demand out of nowhere. It was like someone walking up to me and saying, "Hey, your imaginary friend owes me money." The next morning, I found a woman standing at the front gate like she was inspecting property she already owned. Blonde bob. Pearl earrings. Lavender windbreaker. She introduced herself as Susan, president of the HOA. "We've been very patient," she said. "This property has been a blight on the neighborhood for decades." I stared. "Lady, my uncle had more cows than neighbors." She didn't laugh. Instead, she launched into a sermon about community standards and beautification efforts. She claimed she'd submitted multiple reports over the years. Then she handed me a business card with a real estate firm's logo and said, "If you're overwhelmed, I can help you sell discreetly. We'd even consider waiving part of the fines." Ah, there it was. She wasn't just a clipboard warrior. She wanted the land. Had probably wanted it for years. But Lou, stubborn to the end, never budged. Now she figured the clueless, grieving kid in boots would roll over. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I smiled, told her I'd think about it, and watched her leave with the kind of self-satisfaction only people with too much power and too little opposition ever wear. That night, I set up a whiteboard in the living room. Notes, maps, a binder labeled HOA War Plan. I wasn't grieving anymore. I was planning. And then, like a bad sitcom, it got worse. I opened the mailbox to find a pink envelope notice of foreclosure signed by the HOA's treasurer. They'd already started the process. I hadn't even unpacked my duffel bag. What they didn't realize, they just handed me the rope and I was already tying knots. The next few days were a blur of research, documents cowering, and watching Susan drive by slowly like she was casing the place. I'd wake up to fresh notices pinned to the fence claims that the goats were too loud before 7 a.m. or that the scarecrow had a threatening posture. Yes, you read that right. A threatening scarecrow. So I played dumb. Let them underestimate me. Meanwhile, I drove into town, got the HOA's charter, pulled zoning maps, requested archived development plans from the late 90s. What I found made my blood boil. The HOA was formed in 1999. Lose land? Never included in the original development. No covenant. No annexation. No voluntary inclusion. His land sat just outside their jurisdiction like an old mule they never quite corralled. But now, years later, they were trying to retroactively rope it in. Then Brad showed up again. No tie this time. Golf shirt. Sunglasses. Clipboard still in hand. He pitched community harmony. Claimed a local buyer was interested in someone who'd handle everything quietly if I was feeling overwhelmed. Does their name rhyme with Susan? I asked. He didn't laugh. They never laugh. Instead, the next morning I found a noise violation for my rooster. The one Lou had probably raised from an egg sometime around the first Bush presidency. It all went into the binder, every fine, every letter, every passive-aggressive drive-by. I time-stamped photos. Made spreadsheets. Built a wall of documentation. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd play forensic. Then Susan held a public community meeting in the cul-de-sac bordering the ranch. Folding chairs. A podium. She stood there like a small-town mayor pitching a new sewage system, ranting about how holdouts were sabotaging property values. Someone clapped. Someone else asked if the ranch could be condemned. I watched from a distance, sipping lemonade. That night, I dug deeper. Found an online forum. A former resident had posted about being driven out by Susan and her HOA mafia. Same tactics. Phantom fines. Legal threats. Lowball offers. She even named Susan. I messaged her. She responded in an hour. We weren't alone. By the end of the night, I had 5 stories. Each one nearly identical. This wasn't about goats or shade structures. This was about flipping land. Consolidating control. Susan had been at it for years. Then came the final straw. A letter duct taped to the barn door. Not a violation. A personal letter on HOA letterhead, clearly written by Susan. It was polite, warm even, but underneath was the same smug threat. Resisting community progress often leads to unnecessary hardship. Let's talk. I invited her over. Brewed coffee. Cleaned the porch. Set up my laptop and documents like it was a legal war room. Installed a voice recorder under the table. When she arrived, she smiled like she already owned the place. Offered a new number backed by investors. I asked her one question: what legal basis did the HOA have to find property never included in its charter? She blinked. Just for a second. Then she said something about historical inclusion and evolving community boundaries. I slid the county zoning map across the table. The one that clearly showed Lou's ranch outside their jurisdiction. Then I leaned in. Susan, you're trespassing. You've issued fraudulent claims. Initiated illegal foreclosure proceedings. You've made this personal. I'm going to make it legal. She left without a word. But it wasn't over. A week later, I was served with a restraining order alleging I had harassed and threatened the HOA board. Laughable. I filed a response the same day. Attached the audio. A written rebuttal. My law school buddy helped polish it. At the hearing, Susan came dressed like she was headed to a charity gala. Their lawyer was a bumbling family attorney who mispronounced easement. I calmly laid out the facts. Played the audio. Showed the map. The notarized letter Lou had filed in 2004 declining to join the HOA. The judge tossed the restraining order out immediately. Warned them against filing false claims again. That night, I got an anonymous envelopian internal HOA memo. Someone had slipped it to me. It detailed a plan to annex the ranch through a zoning loophole. Game over. I filed a counterclaim the next morning. Harassment, slander of title, fraudulent foreclosure, abuse of process. When they deposed me, I wore the same muddy boots, answered every question calmly, even pulled out their own memo. They went quiet. Days later, the court accepted my claim. The judge ruled the HOA had no authority. The foreclosure was void, the liens fraudulent. I was awarded $118,000 in damages. Susan? Personally admonished for unethical conduct. She was voted out of the HOA board the next day. Brad resigned. I stayed. Fixed up the chicken coop. Painted the barn. Built a new fence exactly 3 inches taller than the one Susan had once cited. Hung a handmade sign on the gate, private property. No HOAs. No Susans. And every morning when I hear the rooster scream at sunrise and the goats stomp through the dust, I smile. Because Susan thought she could bully me off my land. She forgot the one thing that mattered most. I don't scare easy.